For a time that he could not understand, Brian could do nothing. Even after his mind began working, he could see what had happened. He could do nothing. It was as if his hands and arms were lead. Then he looked for the ways for it not to have happened. Be asleep, his mind screaming at the pilot. Just be asleep and your eyes will open now and your hands will take the controls and your feet will have move to the pedals. But it did not happen. The pilot did not move except that his head rolled on a neck impossibly loose. A plane hit a small bit of turbulence. Somehow the plane was still flying. Seconds had passed. Nearly a minute, and the plane flew on as if nothing had happened, and he had to do something, but did not know what. Help! He had to help. He stretched one hand toward the pilot, saw that his fingers were trembling, touched the pilot on the chest. He did not know what to do. He knew there were procedures that you could do mouth to mouth on victims of heart attacks and push their chests, CPR. But he did not know how to do it, and in any case could not do it with a pilot who was sitting up in the seat and still strapped in with his seatbelt. So he touched the pilot with the tips of his fingers, touched him on the chest, and could feel nothing. No heartbeat, no rise and fall of breathing, which meant that the pilot was almost certainly dead. "Please," Brian said, but did not know what or who to ask. "Please." The plane lurched again, hit more turbulence, and Brian felt the nose drop. Did not dive, but the nose went down slightly. The down angle increased the speed, and he knew that at this angle, the slight angle down, he would ultimately fly into the trees. He could see them ahead on the horizon. Before he could see only sky. He had to fly it somehow. He had to fly the plane. He had to help himself. The pilot was gone beyond anything that he could do. He had to try and fly the plane. He turned back in the seat, facing the front, and put his hands, still trembling, on the control wheel, his feet gently on the rudder pedals. He pulled back on the stick to raise the plane. He knew that from reading. You always pull back on the wheel. Gave it a tug and slid back towards him easily, too easily. The plane, with the increased speed from the tilt down, swooped eagerly up and drove Brian's stomach down. He pushed the wheel back in, went too far this time, and the plane nose went below the horizon, and the engine speed increased with a shallow dive. Too much. He pulled back again, more gently this time, and the nose floated up again. Too far, but not as violently as before. Then down a bit too much, and up again as before. Then down a bit too much, and up again very easily, and the front of the engine cowling settled. When he had aimed it at the horizon, it seemed to be steady. He held at the wheel where it was, let out his breath, which he had been holding all this time, and tried to think what to do next. It was clear blue sky with fluffy bits of clouds here and there, and he looked out the window for a moment, hoping to see something, a town or a village, but there was nothing, just the green of trees and endless green and lakes scattered more and more thickly as the plane flew. Where? He was flying, but did not know where. He had no idea where he was going. He looked at the dashboard of the plane, studied the dials, and hoped to get some help, hoped to find a compass, but it was all so confusing, a jumble of numbers and lights. One lighted display in the top center of the dashboard said the number 342. Another next to it said 22. Down beneath that were dials with lines that seemed to indicate what the winds were doing, tipping or moving, and one dial with a needle pointing to the number 70, which he only thought might be the altimeter, the device that told him his height above the ground or above sea level. Somewhere he had something about altimeters, but couldn't remember where or anything about them. Slightly to the left and below the altimeter, he saw a small rectangular panel with a lighted dial and two knobs. His eyes had passed it over 2 or 3 times before he saw what was written in tiny letters on the top of the panel. Transmitter 221 was stamped in the middle, and it hit him, finally, that this was a radio. The radio, of course. He had to use a radio. when the pilot had been hit that way. Well, he couldn't bring himself to say that the pilot was dead. Couldn't think it. He had been trying to use a radio. Brian looked at the pilot. The headset was still on his head, turned sideways a bit from his jamming back into the seat, and the microphone switch was clipped into his belt. Brian had to get the headset from the pilot, had to reach over and get the headset from the pilot, or he would not be able to use the radio or to call help. He had to reach over. His hands began trembling again. He did not want to touch the pilot, did not want to reach for him, but he had to get the radio. He lifted his hands from the wheel just slightly and held them, waiting to see what would happen. The plane flew on normally, smoothly. All right, he thought, now to do this thing. He turned and reached for the headset, slid it from the pilot's head, one eye on the plane, waiting for it to dive. The headset came easily, but the microphone switch at the pilot's belt was jammed in, and he had to pull it to get it loose. When he pulled, his elbow bumped the wheel and pushed it in, and the plane started down in a shallow dive. Brian grabbed the wheel and pulled it back too hard again, and the plane went through another series of stomach-wrenching swoops up and down before he could get it under control. When things had settled again after he pulled at the mic cord once more, at last jerked the cord free. It took him another second or two to place the headset on his own head and position the small microphone tube in front of his mouth. He had seen the pilot use it, had seen him depress the switch at his belt. So Brian pushed the switch in and blew into the mic. He heard the sound of his breath in the headset. Hello? Is there anybody listening on this? Hello? He repeated it 2 or 3 times and then waited, but heard nothing except for his own breathing. Panic came then. He had been afraid, had been stopped with terror of what was happening, but now panic came and he began to scream into the microphone, scream over and over. Help! Somebody help me! I'm in this plane and don't know! And then he started crying with the screams, crying and slamming his hands against the wheel of the plane, causing it to jerk down, then back up, back again. He heard nothing but the sound of his sob in the microphone, his own screams mocking him, coming back into his ears. The microphone awareness cut him. He used a CB radio in his uncle's pickup once. He had to turn the mic switch off to hear anybody else. He reached to his belt and released the switch. For a second, all he heard was of the empty airwaves. And then, through the noise and static, he heard a voice. Whoever's calling on the radio net, I repeat, release your mic switch. You're covering me. You are covering me.